Hi guys, today we're talking about Article 4 and licensing. What are they? Are they important and are they the same thing? Article 4 is basically a piece of planning legislation that says you can't convert a house from a C3 dwelling, which is your residential property, to a C4 dwelling, which is your HMO, without going through planning. Article 4 is all over the country in different areas, but it's not like a massive map saying you can't invest in the north. It's council specific, so each council will decide whether or not it would like to have Article 4 and in which areas, which postcodes, which streets that covers. The main reason they've done this is to increase the standard of HMOs in an area. If you find that one area's got a lot of really substandard HMOs, maybe there's a lot of 4-beds with really small rooms and things like that, or they're just not really very nice properties and the landlords aren't taking care of their tenants, you might find that Article 4 is introduced in order to make sure that every HMO from then on is done to a high standard. Or you can find they put it in because there are simply too many HMOs in one area. They want to limit the number of houses of multiple occupancy on the market to protect residential housing and parking in the streets and things like that. If you already have a property and you convert it to an HMO, and then Article 4 comes in afterwards, you have something called grandfather rights. That means that you've already converted your property to C4 and you do not need to go through planning. This is particularly good in a lot of cases because you'll probably see a bump in value. Why is this? Because property in an Article 4 area where people wanted to buy an HMO that was up and running, but they couldn't because they couldn't go out and buy a house and then convert it. They wanted an HMO in that area. They knew it was a good area, but they couldn't do it because of Article 4. Now, why don't you just go through planning? This is a very good question. You can. There's no reason why you couldn't go for planning and try and get planning on a property, but if you've bought a house with the plan of renting it out as an HMO, and then you can't because you don't get the planning, then you're stuck with a house that's going to make a crap return because it's probably more expensive than a single let. What are you going to do then? Do you have to sell the property? It's not worth the hassle. It's really not worth the hassle. I mean, you could use things like purchase options or buy it subject to planning, but it's really not really worth the hassle. You're much better off just going to a different area and buying a property where you're not in Article 4. As I mentioned before about when Article 4 comes in, you'll likely see a bump in capital gains. Councils have to tell you 12 months in advance whether or not they're going to issue Article 4. So for example, right now we're in May, and in September, Doncaster will issue Article 4. I know this because 12 months ago, they told us. So the council will always issue 12 months in advance whether or not they're going to put Article 4 in place. And if you speak to councils, they'll likely know, or just wait, be active on the local forums, speak to investors in the area, speak to HMO managers in the area, they're guaranteed to know. And the news will spread quite quickly. So as long as you're active in all the right areas, you're likely to get the information you need pretty quickly. It doesn't take 12 months to buy a house. Licensing. What is licensing? So you have two different types of licensing. You have mandatory licensing and selective licensing. Mandatory licensing is the kind of licensing you get on an HMO that says if you're renting a house out that has 5 or more bedrooms, then you need to use a license. It technically uses the word households, and what defines as a household is usually people who are non-related. And licensing will usually stipulate pretty standard things like you're going to need fire doors and fire alarms and smoke alarms and things like that. You're also going to need things like a certain number of hobs in a kitchen, enough kitchen space for people to work, enough cupboard space, things like this. You can get all your specifics online. There will always be a guidance pack that says all the information you need to know, how many bathrooms you need in the house, all that sort of stuff. So it's very, very easy to find. I would also recommend after you've bought a property, get an HMO manager who knows the area, who knows the council, to go around the property and give it a once over and say, look, I know why you're refurbing this, you probably put fire doors in anyway. You need to add a bit more kitchen space in here. Or you don't have enough bathrooms, you need to put a bathroom in or something like that. Or they'll say, no, this property is really good. But you can also ask them questions about the area and things like that. So you see how they're going to work. You'd have done all this as part of your due diligence. You've already bought the house, you've already checked it all. It's always good to get someone in at that stage anyway who can come in and give it the final once over and say, yeah, this is good or not. In the lead up to getting a property license, apply for licensing. The moment you've applied for licensing, you can put tenants in. You don't actually have to have gotten it yet. Having said that, if you fail licensing, your tenants will have to move out. So make sure you're up to standard, and licensing is not hard to hit. It's like put fire doors in. It's just looking after your tenants and being a good landlord anyway. So your property should be compliant, regardless of whether you need a license or not. Selective licensing is usually in areas that aren't so good. So in the slightly worse off areas of town, places where there's maybe a lot of rubbish outside or it's quite noisy, there'll be a high crime rate, house prices are going to be lower. You'll probably find you have selective licensing there. That means that any house that is going to be tenanted, single-let HMO, regardless of the number of rooms, will need a license from the council. These are usually cheaper than the HMO licenses, your mandatory licenses, and they're not strict. So it's not like you have to have this many bathrooms in. It's just a case of your tenants have to be good tenants. You have to look after the property well. You have to maintain the property well. You've got to make sure the rubbish is kept tidy. You've got to make sure that the house isn't too noisy and things like that. Some things I get you don't have that much control over, so it can put people off. But at the same time, if you do your house up quite nicely, you tend to attract better tenants. And if you have a good letting agent, good HMO manager in place, they'll look after the tenants and make sure that they're doing their duties. But it is your responsibility as the landlord to make sure that your property and your tenants meet the requirements that are necessary. Again, all these requirements are online. The government does everything that it can to make sure this information is easy for you to obtain. You just have to know to look for it, which is where your education comes into place. I hope this video has been useful for you guys, and now you understand the difference between Article 4 and licensing. Always check them, especially if you're doing things like HMOs. When you're buying a house and you tell an estate agent you want to buy the property for an investment purchase, tell them what you want to use it for, get their opinion. You don't have to use it, but they'll usually tell you if you need selective licensing or mandatory licensing in that area anyway, regardless of whether or not they're an expert. So that gives you an idea as to whether or not you're going to need it, and then you can double check that. You can clarify that at a later date. Thank you guys so much for watching. If you like this video, please like and subscribe, and I'll see you next time.